Good morning or good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to come to this Spring version 2 update webinar. My name is Alejandra Pistañesi. I am the Spring Product Manager in Global Gap. I base in Argentina. And today we are going to talk about the updates in version 2. This webinar is going to be recorded. Then you can ask the questions in the chat. I am going to answer all the questions at the end of the webinar. The idea is to give you an update about the general rules that are the most important changes in version 2 of Spring, talk about the date and the transition period, and at the end we are going to talk about the principles and criteria, not in detail because we need a full training to go deep in each requirement, but I am going to highlight the most important changes. Please, if you have any question, write it in the chat. We are going to give you all the time that you need to answer all your questions today. That's the idea of this webinar. I hope that it will be useful for you. I am going to start with the dates, with the important date and the transition period. You know that we published Spring version 1.1.1 in 2020, where we update only the rules, not the control point. In this moment, we have a high demand about sustainable agriculture. This trend is increasing very fast. Today, the consumers want more information about the product that they buy, and they ask for more positive impacts of the production. Okay, Spring is the way to show that the producers are doing the right things about water and land use. This trend was increasing the number of producers very fast from 2020 to now. The number of producers in Spring are the double each year. It's a really good number. Today we have the new version that we work during 2023. We have some technical committees. We work together with producers, certification bodies, retailers, and NGOs that for us are really important to improve the Spring content. We work with some NGOs, most in specific high-risk regions like Spain, for example. And during this review, we try to simplify the rules of Spring and align with IFA version 6, because we realize that the rules are so complex and confused because are different to other Global Gap products. And on September, the 5th of September, we published the version 2. We published the document in English and in Spanish, and at the same time, because 80% of the producers with Spring speaking Spanish are in Spain or Latam. But now we have the document in different languages, the most common languages that use Spring. If you need Spring in another language that is not available in version 2, please let us know, because we plan the translations depending on the demand. Then we have in Portuguese, in Italian, in French, but if you need in another language, please let us know, then we can plan to translate to your language. Spring version 2 is going to be mandatory after the 1st of January 2024, together with IFA version 6. Remember that on January 2024, version 6 Smart is going to be mandatory. Then the producers with version 6 need to do Spring in version 2. But the producers who are going to continue with version 5.4.1, waiting for the GFSI recognition, they can continue with Spring version 1.1.1, because version 2 is aligned with version 6 of IFA. If the producer is using a version 5 certification in IFA, they need to continue with version 1.1.1 for spring, okay? That's because some requirements are deleted in spring version 2 because are major must now in IFA version 6. Please, if you have any question about this transition, let me know and I am going to answer later. One more step for 2025, after the 1st of January, again, if the country has an national interpretation guideline for spring, this document is going to be mandatory for the producers and for the certification bodies. This doesn't mean that all the countries need a national interpretation guideline, but in the cases where the interpretation guideline is prepared by the National Technical Working Group, this guideline is mandatory. I am going to clarify that many times during this presentation because it's very important. And something that is important is that some retailers are requesting spring to all their producers in water scarcity regions for 2025, some for 2026, and some retailers are asking for spring in all the countries, not only in the high-risk countries, okay? Then this is the summary about the dates. I am going to start talking about the regulations, the specifications of a spring. I think that the changes that we did are going to be very useful for you to understand easier the idea of spring. We want to have a better water management. We don't want to have really complex rules. Then about the document, we have the general regulation specification for spring. All the information that is not detailed in the document about spring is because we are based on the IFA rules. We have the spring principles and criteria, and in the cases that national interpretation guidelines are available in the country, these guidelines are going to be mandatory documents for this country. But again, to be very clear, the guidelines are not mandatory for spring, are mandatory in the case that the country develop this guideline. We really consider that these guidelines are very useful, especially to look for the legislation identification and how to comply that, because sometimes the water use legislation is very different in each country, and sometimes it's very different in each region of a country. Then we really promote that each country has their own national interpretation guideline, but we don't want to do it mandatory because in some countries, maybe we have a couple of producers with spring. These guidelines has more sense in countries with a lot of producers, I don't know, like Spain, Chile, Peru, etc. Okay, about the registration process, I am going to focus on the news on the update, but I am going to mention some important information that was previous. You know that the producer need to be registered for spring with the same CV that is doing IFA or for processing, and this CV must be approved for spring, okay? At the beginning was a problem because we have not too much certification bodies approved, and we allow different CVs with version 1. But now we have many certification bodies approved for spring, more than 70 in this moment. We are giving the spring update for the CVs that are already approved. We started 1 month ago, and we are going to start giving the full spring version 2 CV trainings in December. Then we are not going to have a problem about the availability of certification bodies. Please, if you find in a country or in a specific situation that you have no certification bodies available, let us know, contact us, and we can support you to solve the situation. At the end of the presentation, I am going to give you our contacts in case that you need something or some support about Spring. Then, we didn't change anything about the fees and about the data access rules. You know that the fees for Global Gap are not expensive for producers. It's 30 euros per option 1 without QMS, and is 130 euros per QMS and 10 euros per site or producer in the case of option 1 multi-site or option 2. The rest of the cost depends on the certification body, the duration of the assessment, the complexity of the irrigation system, etc. And there are not changes in the data access rules. The only producers that are going to be shown in our IT system with Spring are the producers with Spring. Okay, not changes here. Something very important is about parallel ownership, because we made many changes here to give more transparency to Spring. The first point is, remember that in version 6, now we talk about parallel ownership when we are talking about parallel ownership or parallel production. Both are considered in this concept of parallel ownership, that in version 5, we have like 2 different concepts, now are all together. Then there are some important changes here. Option 1 producers cannot do parallel ownership. It's not allowed. One GCN number cannot have the same product with Spring and without Spring. This is to give more transparency to the certification, because in some cases we realize that some producers has Spring only in one farm, for example, in one site, but with the GCN they identify all the product, and it's not possible for the retailer to understand if the product comes from a Spring site or not. That's why parallel ownership is not more possible in option 1. This is very important. I am going to repeat it at the end of the presentation. In the other hand, for option 2, producer groups, they can do parallel ownership, but only some producers can have Spring and some other producers not. The idea here is that you can trace the producer with their own GCN, not the GCN of the group, and understand if this producer has Spring or not. All the sites of the producer must have Spring, okay? I am going to explain specifically the details about this option 2 parallel ownership at the end of the presentation. But to give you an overview, we have some extra requirements about traceability, segregation, and about communication with the client. Then the groups must be very clear with the client, mentioning that they have no Spring in all the producers in the group. Again, this is to give more transparency to the Spring approval. I am going to answer all the questions at the end, okay? About the presentation, don't worry, I am going to share with you the recording, and if you need, we can share the presentation. But all the other questions I am going to answer at the end. Okay, about the audit process. About the audit process, remember that we ask for a self-assessment in option 1 or an internal assessment or internal audit in the case of option 2 or option 1 with QMS. This assessment must be done always before the CV assessment. The spring letter of conformance is going to be always 12 months or less, depending when the assessment is done, but not more than that. And you must consider that the self-assessment or internal assessment was in the general rules before. Now this requirement is in the principles and criteria to avoid problems with producers that sometimes base only on the principles and criteria and not on the rules. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Then remember that spring can be done together with IFA or Crawford processing annually. But if you are in Crawford processing that you receive the assessment not each year, for spring you are going to receive an annual assessment, okay? Something that we keep, that is not a change, but is important to highlight, is that the initial spring audit can be done in a different moment, not together with IFA, but the second one is always going to be together with IFA. This allows to have the same validity date of the certificate and the letter of conformance in our IT system. That's allowed to have only one external assessment per year. That's allowed to receive the extension of spring if you ask for an extension for IFA or for processing. The idea about that is simplify the process and the validity dates. Something that is important too is if the legal entity is selected for an announced assessment, an announced audit, and they have spring is going to be audited together with IFA in this assessment. This is not a change, but it's something that we want to highlight to all of you. About the audit duration, you know that the audit duration depends on the size of the farm and the complexity of the production activities and the irrigation system, for example. And I always mention that this depends on the organization of the producer and yes, how organized is it and how easy is to find the documents, for example, during an assessment. But after that, we change the minimum duration for the external audit. We consider that 2 hours is enough for option 1 in the simplest case, and 1 hour per producer or 1 hour per site in option 2 or option 1 multi-site with UMS. In both cases, 1 hour is enough for the most simplest case. I received some comments about, for example, in Latin America, the spring assessment is longest, but it's because we have sometimes really big farms. Remember that half of the producers in Global Gap has less than 2 hectares. Then we set up a minimum duration for the assessment that is less than before, because it doesn't make sense to have a longest assessment if the auditor is going to check part of the requirement together with IFA, and then it's going to complete the checklist and check the extra requirement. This keeps the external assessment or the external audit easy for the producer, not too long, and cheaper for the producer. Of course, if there is more complex situations, the certification body are going to consider more time, okay? Any questions about that, let me know. About the compliance system and the letter of conformance, this is something that changed more in spring. We changed many things here. If you remember, in version 1.1.1, we have critical, major, and minor requirements. Now we delete the critical requirement, we change it to major must. Of course, are mandatory. The producer cannot approve if they don't comply with the major must, but it's easier to understand because in the previous version, we have these extra rules about critical non-compliance cannot be correct in 28 days. We have different consequence for the producer, was a little confused. Then now we have only major mass and minor mass. The point that were critical now are major mass that are not possible to be not applicable. We didn't limit the possibility to correct the non-conformities now. And remember that we consider, instead of yes or no, in option 1 of Spring, we consider the compliance was 0, 1, 2, or 3, that this was so confused for producers and sometimes for auditors. Then we change and we align with IFA, and now you can consider the compliance for each requirement, yes or no. If you remember the checklist format, it was very different in Spring if you compare with IFA. Now it's exactly like in IFA. You have the number of the requirement, you have the principle, the criteria, and you have the level and the comments, right? Then we align very much with IFA to simplify the process, and the same for the results. The results previously in version 1 were critical, improvement needed, and certified. Now we have only 2 possible results that are approved or not approved. Okay, certified or not certified. In the previous version, we have different consequences depending on the result, and the internal assessor and the CV need a decision tree to understand the process and understand the result. Now it's more simple. Again, the producer need to comply with 100% of the major mass and 75% of minor mass. Why 75% and not 95%? Is because are really not too much requirements, then we have now the possibility to calculate 95% of the requirement. Are not too much, then the producer need to have a margin of mistakes. That's why it's 75% of the requirement. If the producer has 100% of major mass and 75% of minor mass, this producer is going to receive the letter of conformance. Something more that we delete is the corrective action plan for the minor mass non-compliance on after the 75% of the compliance. That was so confused in the previous version, we deleted. Then the producer has an initial audit. Remember, in the initial audit, the producer has 3 months to take the corrective actions. In the subsequent audits, they have 28 days. As usual, it's exactly the same rules than IFA. And now we have QMS requirement. We have 3 new requirements, and of course, the group must correct and must comply with 100% of these requirements to be approved, because always the QMS requirements are major mass. Then the certification body is going to check the result of the assessment, and is going to take a decision. If the producer has a positive certification decision, the CV issues a letter of conformance in the Global Gap IT system. Remember that we changed now the certification body is not doing for themselves the letter of conformance and the certification bodies. This is going to be done by our IT system, the validation service in this moment, that is going to give more transparency to the process too. Then this is the summary about the rules. Very shortly, we are going to talk about the principles and criteria and the updates. I want to give you an overview about the changes. Of course, the numbers of the points change because we delete some requirements that are duplicate in Spring version 2 and in IFA version 6. Then we delete it. Some requirements were present in version 1 of Spring because were minor requirement in IFA, but now we change this water requirement to measure mass, then Spring delete it to avoid duplications. Again, we have only now measure and minor principles and criteria, not more critical requirement, and the format of the checklist follow the same format than the IFA checklist. And remember that previously in version 1, we have a mandatory audit before the on-site audit. We have 4 requirements that must be checked in a previous audit, previous to go to the farm. And now we delete this mandatory audit because we realized that didn't add the value that we expect. Sometimes the first year, yes, because the auditor knows the document before go to the farm, but the second or the subsequent years are not so useful and it's more complex for the producer and for the CV to plan the assessment, the audit. Then this is not more mandatory. Is possible, of course, if the producer and the CV agree that they prefer to have a previous document audit before the on-site audit is okay, but it's not more mandatory. And again, this simplifies the process to audit the producer. I am going to give you a summary of changes. Don't worry, I am going to share with you the recording and the presentation. You don't need to take notes, but this is a good summary to show you the changes. Some, of course, the critical requirements that were 3 now are measure must. Remember that any of them can be not applicable. We add only 1 new requirement that is related to the self-assessment or internal audit that previously was present in the rules, but not in the requirement. And sometimes producers discuss with the auditors about where this requirement was. That's why we decide to include it in the principles and criteria. It's the only new requirement. The requirement that were deleted were because were included in another requirement. We mix some points that are too similar, and we delete the requirement that now are measure must in IFA version 6. That means that we didn't have less requirement in Spring. We have more requirements because we include more details about what we expect in each of the points. And in some cases, we change minor requirement to measure requirement. You can have an overview here. And due to that, we changed the number of the position of the requirement because we simplify a little bit. For example, here you have 311, 312, 313. We simplify to 31, 32, 33. We try to keep Spring more simple to understand and remember, but we didn't delete requirement. We have more requirements. For example, in the stakeholder identification, that is one of the requirements. Now we include the NGOs that are very important for us, and we increase a little bit the requirement in each point, but not new requirements. Let me know if I am not clear, please. Then this is the summary of changes. I am not going to talk about each of them because we need the full update training. We are going to offer that training soon, but I am going to stop in traceability because traceability is the part that changed a lot, especially for option 2. Remember that for option 1, it's not possible to have parallel ownership. This is important. For option 2, that is possible to have parallel ownership, the producer group need to have a system to segregate and trace the spring and the not spring product. They cannot mix spring and not spring products. The responsible of the group must communicate with the client that not all the producer group are registered for Spring add-on. Again, this is to give more transparency to the system, because in some cases we found big groups that has only a couple of producers with the Spring, and they identify all the product with the GGN number of the group, and was not clear for the client that not all of them has Spring. Then they need to segregate and trace the spring and the not spring product. They need to communicate with the client that not all the members are registered and approved for spring. And they need an annual mass balance calculations for the product for producers groups that are registered for spring for each product. And something more that is very important, the products cannot be identified with the GGN of the group. The products must be identified with the GGN of each producer, okay? Then this requirement is not applicable for option 2 when 100 of the producers has spring, because in this case, all of them has spring is not a problem. The problem is in the groups where you have some producers with a spring and some producers without a spring for the same product. This is the biggest change in the principles and criteria, and something that is completely new in version 2 is that we add requirement for the QMS. These requirements were implicit in version 1.1.1, but we have now the possibility for the auditor to check it and to give us evidence. Then you are going to see that it looks like repetitive, but we have 3 QMS requirements. The first one is that the QMS must show that the implementation of Spring is part of the QMS, okay? That includes all the concepts about implement and audit the producer, has the register completely, has all the information about the producers with and without the Spring. All this information is included sorry, in QMS number 1. QMS number 2 asks for internal audits for Spring, ask for the available audit reports, the internal audit reports at the moment of the external audit, the identification of non-compliance, and the corrective actions to be sure that only the producers that are approved for Spring are included in Spring in the group. Remember that the certification body audit certify the QMS, certify the group, and it's the group who approve the members. Then we include this requirement to have all the internal audits well covered by the QMS. And the last point, the third point, again, is only applicable for groups who has not the 100% of the producers registered for Spring. We ask in the QMS to communicate to the client that not all the producers are in Spring, and we ask for identification and traceability with the GGNF, the GGN number of each producer, and that includes random control of pallets when the QMS include packing handling units. Then during the QMS assessment, they are going to check this pallet in the PHU. This is the summary. We are perfect on time. We are going to give time to you to ask questions. Before that, I am going to read in the chat now. I want to show you that you can look for more information about this and about all the news in our website, www.globalgap.org. We changed the website last week. We have a completely new website. Then you can find a lot of information about Spring and about other products, and all the documents are available here in this website. All the Spring documents in version 2 are available for free in our document center in the website. About Instagram, we have Global Gap profile, my profile, where I post more in Spanish, but only in case that are useful for you, you have my profile there. And we have the GGN label profile. Remember that in this moment, the customers are asking a lot about choose products in the supermarket or in the restaurant that are more responsible with the environment and with the community, and GGN label is a great opportunity to show that. Then you can see more information in Instagram about that. And we are going to give a webinar for free about GGN label in 2 weeks in Spanish, and then in a couple of weeks in Portuguese, in English, in different languages. It's very important because it's the trend, it's the future of Global Gap in this moment. You can find the videos, the recording of the webinars and other videos in 2 different YouTube channels, in Global Gap 08 and in my own channel, that is Alejandra Pistagnesi. That is how you need to write my name. And again, in LinkedIn, Global Gap or Alejandra Pistagnesi, you can follow all the news. We are posting a lot because there are a lot of changes and transitions and all the news about the GFSI recognition. All of that are in this social media to support you more. In case you have specific questions about our IT system, you can contact customer support email. In case you have specific technical questions, you can contact standard support email. Okay, these are our usual emails. Of course, I have a disclaimer here, but I am going to come back and give you the opportunity to see that in the time that I am going to read the questions. Then, first question about the presentation. Yes, we are going to share the recording, and if you need the presentation, we can share it with you, with all the registered people in the webinar. I have another question. So by 2024, every grower will be required to be certified for water. It depends the client, it depends in which country they are. Most of the clients or supermarkets are asking for Spring to all their producers in water scarcity regions, countries. How to know that? You can go to the water filter map. That is the WWF map about water scarcity regions. If you have know the information about that, I can share it with you very fast. I can share the link with you. Let me know, and I can add it in the chat. But if you are in a water scarcity country, probably you are going to need Spring for 2025 or 2026, depending on your client. If you are not in a water scarcity country, it's possible that you have different timelines. Okay, we are talking in general, but after you need to contact with your supermarket, your client. We are going to talk a lot about that in Food Logistica next year in Berlin in February. Then, yeah, we are going to give you all the updates about that in social media too. Then I have another question. In order to check a certificate audit report, which are the critical points that the producer, yes or yes, have to comply? The producer must comply 100% of the major requirements, and 75% of minor requirement. That's the limit to be approved. If the producer is approved, you can be sure that they comply with all the critical topics. If the producer is not approved, you are not going to see that this producer has a Spring. But Palmira, if you ask the question about something specific, let me know and I can support you more. Here, hello, are Global Gap chain of custody certificate holders somehow subject to report control volume from suppliers with add-ons such as Spring? How is the interaction among these both certificates? Thank you. Chain of custody is only about traceability, about IFA or not IFA, okay? This is for the stakeholders in the supply chain that are not producers. And there is not specific requirement about Spring for the chain of custody certificate holders, okay? These are more related to IFA certification. It's going to help a lot in the process. And you know that is an important requirement for the GGN label too, but there is no specific requirement about Spring in this case. I have another question. Are there exceptions with small holders? I am not sure about what you are talking about in is if there are exceptions about has not Spring. Please, if you clarify that, you help me a lot. I am going to, please share. I thought you are talking about the map. I am going to share the map with you. I am going to show you how to find it. You need to write WWF water filter map. I am going to share the link. Only to show you how to find it. If you don't remember the link, this is the link. In this, you can find two different filters. You have a water risk filter and you have a biodiversity risk filter. But water risk filter is the most important for us in this moment. You go there and you go to maps. And this is a great work that WWF did about different colors of different levels of risk in each country. For example, you can go to Europe, only like an example, and you are going to have a zoom to Europe, and you can see the different colors. And if you want to see specifically, I don't know, Spain, because you see that Spain has more orange or red colors, you go to Spain and you have more the detail. But you can see very easy in which regions you have more problems. And of course, you have a zoom to go deeper in each region. Most of the customers are using this map for the reference about water scarcity countries. In some cases, they consider to ask for Spring only in the more risky regions in the countries. In some cases, they prefer to ask for Spring for all the country to avoid that they have some producers not using Spring. In some cases, the supermarket asks for Spring in countries without water scarcity. I'm going to close that. Because they want, Spring is not only about water scarcity, it's about protect the water that is available too, okay? Then you can use the link, the filter. We have more extra information in the website. If you need it, you can use it too. Okay, next questions. What are the qualifications required for the Spring internal auditor? Thank you. Nisirin, we have no specific requirement for the internal auditor. This is something that the quality management system must confirm. You remember that in the quality management system, you need to take the decision about which trainings need your auditors. Of course, it's very logical that they consider that in a Spring training is necessary for the Spring internal auditors, okay? In your case that you are a registered trainer, we are going to have a specific webinar with more detail, more technical details only for registered trainers to be updated for Spring version 2, including all the principles and criteria. Okay. Some stakeholders are only using the rain of water and do not use rivers or other ways to irrigate. Okay. Is there an exception then? No, there is no an exception. In this case, the audit is going to be easier because the auditor is only going to check, for example, the environmental protection, is going to check the traceability, is going to check another requirement that are not relating to the irrigation. Remember that the Spring has 5 different parts. The first are related to improvement about water and land use and the identification of stakeholders and the positive relationship with the stakeholders, and that is applicable for these producers. The second part is related to the legislation, the law compliance about water and land use, and this is applicable too. The third part is the only technical part about irrigation that is possible, that is not applicable in this case. The part number 4 is related to protect the environment and promote the biodiversity, that is applicable too. And part number 5 is about traceability. If it's a group of option 2 is applicable too. Then there is no exception about they are not going to do Spring. The difference is that the audit is going to be shorter and easier for that producers. I have another question from Chris in Spanish. To be external auditor. To be external auditor, if you are working in a certification body, the certification bodies receive an in-house trainer training. This trainer is going to train the auditors in Spring, and you need to receive a specific training about legislation in the countries and the regions where you are going to perform the assessment. It's very important for us that the auditors are really well trained about legislation, because it's the most important part, or the base of Spring is the compliance with the local legislation about water and land use. Thank you. What is the minimum duration to conduct Spring in case a new grower? The minimum is always the same. I mentioned it before. I can come back to show you it again, but the duration is a little bit here. Wait for me. This is easier I show you. It's 2 hours in option 1 and it's 1 hour in option 2 or option 1 with QMS. Of course, the first time, probably the auditor needs more time, but we don't set up different durations. We have only one, considering the simplest case. Of course, if it's a new producer, maybe it's a little bit more. If it's a producer with IFA for a long time and the auditors knows them, they know how long the audit is going to take. But this is a certification body decision. Sorry, Chris, I didn't see your comment about give an exam always. The in-house trainers give and proctor exam is an exam controlled by a third part in the camera, but the auditors are going to take an online test, and you need to approve, of course, to be an auditor. Yes, you have an exam. I am checking. I don't understand the question about data duration. Can you clarify that, please? Remember that the validity of the letter of conformance of Spring is going to be always the same than IFA. If the first Spring assessment is done in a different moment, not together with IFA, it doesn't matter when, the second or the subsequent assessment is going to be together, IFA and Spring, okay? I don't know if you have more questions. If not, we have 5 more minutes if you have more questions. If not, we are going to close the webinar. I am going to give you again the last screen with the emails to ask questions, just in case you have more questions after. We are going to give trainings. Here you have the emails. We are going to give trainings. We post the trainings in our website and in social media. And remember that in 2 weeks, we are going to give a GCN label webinar, and we are going to start giving GCN label webinars in different languages. You can ask questions about all the topics about Global Gap in these emails. And again, if you have any comment about the new website, please complete the feedback form that I share the link in the chat. And if you need any more, please contact us and we can support you. We have a team that are trying to support you in all these changes and transitions for next year. Then feel free to contact us for all that you need. This is all for my side. I have no more questions in the chat. Then I am going to stop the recording. Thank you so much for your participation today.